Imagine a narrow strip of water just 2.7 kilometers wide at its tightest point that's barely wider than some rivers. Now imagine that through this tiny gap, more than 40% of all global trade passes every single day. Oil for China, Japan and South Korea, goods for Europe, electronics, food, fuel, all of it squeezing through one of the busiest and most strategic waterways on Earth. This is the Strait of Malacca, and right now it is at the center of a very serious geopolitical conversation. In April 2026, Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan stood up at a major business event and made something very clear. The Strait of Malacca will stay open, no tolls, no restrictions, no interference, and Singapore won't allow it. Period. But why is this even a debate right now? What's happening in the world that is suddenly making people worry about this waterway? And what does it mean for global trade, for Asia, and for the balance of power between the United States and China? Let's break it all down. First, let's understand what we are talking about. The Strait of Malacca is a long, narrow sea passage that runs between the Malay Peninsula, where Malaysia sits, and the island of Sumatra, which is part of Indonesia. At the southern end of this passage lies Singapore, one of the world's most important port cities. This strait is the main shipping route connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. If you want to move goods from the Middle East or Europe to countries like China, Japan, South Korea, or Vietnam, and you want to take the shortest sea route, you go through the Strait of Malacca. Every single day, over 100,000 ship transits pass through this route every year. That number actually crossed 100,000 for the first time just recently. We're talking about oil tankers, cargo ships carrying electronics, food containers, and more. It is the single busiest shipping choke point in the world. And 3 countries share its borders: Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. These are the so-called littoral states, the countries that sit along the strait and under international law have certain responsibilities for it. Here's where it gets interesting. Earlier in 2026, a war broke out involving Iran, and one of Iran's moves in that conflict was to effectively shut down another critical waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. This is the narrow passage through which roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil flows, mostly from the Persian Gulf. Iran began charging tolls on ships passing through Hormuz, and the United States under President Donald Trump responded by announcing a naval blockade, saying the US Navy would stop any ships that had paid tolls to Iran. So suddenly, one of the world's most important energy corridors was caught in the middle of a military standoff. Ships couldn't pass freely, oil prices shot up. Asian nations that rely on Gulf oil like China, Japan, and South Korea started feeling the pressure. And people began asking a very uncomfortable question. If this can happen in Hormuz, can it happen in Malacca too? The answer triggered a wave of political statements, debates, and disagreements across Southeast Asia, and that's when things got complicated. On the same day that Singapore's foreign minister made his big statement, April 22, 2026, Indonesia's finance minister Prabaya Yudi Sadeva was speaking at a business symposium in Jakarta. And he floated an interesting idea. He said, Indonesia sits on one of the most strategic trade routes in the world. Ships pass through the Strait of Malacca every day without paying anything to the countries that border it. Why not charge them a toll? He even said, reportedly half joking, that if you split the toll revenue between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, it could be quite substantial. Indonesia controls the largest and longest stretch of the strait after all. Now, Indonesia's government quickly clarified that this was just an idea, not official policy. But the fact that a senior minister of the world's 4th most populous country was even willing to say it out loud sent a chill through global shipping and diplomatic circles. Because this is how norms erode. Someone says something half-jokingly, then someone else takes it seriously, then it becomes a formal proposal, then it becomes a negotiating point. That's the concern. This was also happening in the broader context of Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto pushing a more assertive foreign policy. He had earlier pointed out Indonesia's strategic position not just near Malacca but also controlling the straits of Sunda and Makassar, through which he said 70% of East Asia's energy and trade passes. Are we aware of how important Indonesia is? Prabowo had asked publicly, clearly signaling that Indonesia wants the world to take it more seriously as a geopolitical player. And that's exactly when Singapore stepped in. Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, speaking at the CNBC Converge live event in Singapore, was direct and unambiguous. He said the right of transit passage is guaranteed for everyone. He said Singapore will not participate in any attempts to close, block, or impose tolls in their neighborhood, full stop. He added that Singapore had already communicated this position directly to both Beijing and Washington, the two superpowers who have the most at stake in this waterway. When asked whether Singapore had faced any pressure from foreign governments to change its stance, he said not yet, but acknowledged that such pressure may come. Balakrishnan also stressed that this is not just Singapore's position. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore are all aligned on keeping the strait open. All of us are trade-dependent economies, he said. All of us know it is in our interest to keep it open. He said the three countries operate under a long-standing cooperative mechanism that ensures ships can pass through without charges. And he made a broader point. The strategic alignment of these three countries on this issue is not something you can take for granted everywhere in the world. It's actually quite special. Balakrishnan had made similar comments in Parliament just weeks earlier when asked about the Hormuz crisis. He said transit passage is not a privilege to be granted, not a license to be asked for, and not a toll to be paid. It is a right. This is rooted in UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the international legal framework governing the world's oceans. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the dragon. China is deeply existentially dependent on the Strait of Malacca. The vast majority of China's oil imports from the Middle East travel through this waterway. If the strait were to be blocked or controlled by a hostile power, China's energy supply could be cut off almost immediately. This is what strategists call the Malacca dilemma, a term that became well known during the presidency of Hu Jintao in the early 2000s. China recognizes that in any future conflict with the United States, the US Navy, which currently patrols the strait through its 7th Fleet, could potentially cut off China's energy supplies by blockading this route. This is why China has been quietly working to reduce its dependence on Malacca. It has built oil and gas pipelines through Myanmar to bypass the strait. It has deepened energy ties with Russia to access oil overland, and it has massively accelerated its domestic push for renewable energy and electric vehicles, partly to reduce its reliance on imported oil altogether. But in the short term, China is still highly dependent on Malacca, and any instability in this region, any suggestion that the strait could be closed, tolled, or militarized would set off alarm bells in Beijing. Balakrishnan acknowledged this tension directly. He warned that the greatest danger is if the US-China relationship fractures completely. If they go to war in the Pacific, he said, what you are witnessing now in the Strait of Hormuz is just a dry run. Think about that for a moment. The Hormuz crisis, with its blocked oil shipments, naval standoffs, and soaring energy prices, could be a preview of what a US-China conflict might look like in Southeast Asia. The Strait of Malacca is not just important for Asia, it is a pillar of the entire global trading system. More than a fifth of all global maritime trade passes through it. That includes oil, liquefied natural gas, semiconductor components, consumer goods, agricultural products, and much more. If the strait were disrupted for even a short period, the economic consequences would be felt worldwide. Higher prices, supply chain disruptions, shortages. This is why Singapore's position matters so much. Singapore has built its entire identity and economy around being a trusted, neutral hub at the crossroads of global trade. Its port is one of the busiest in the world. Its financial system processes billions in trade finance every day. Its whole value proposition to the world is that it is a stable, reliable, rules-based partner. If Singapore were ever to allow the strait to be weaponized, to be used as a tool of geopolitical pressure, it would undermine the very foundation of what Singapore is. That's why Balakrishnan's statement was so firm and so public. Singapore was sending a message not just to Indonesia and Malaysia, but to the entire world. So where does this all go from here? For now, the three littoral states, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, appear to be aligned. The Indonesian toll idea has been walked back as informal thinking rather than policy, and international law, specifically UNCLOS, remains the baseline framework that protects the right of free passage. But the underlying pressures aren't going away. The US-China rivalry is intensifying. The Hormuz crisis has shown that great powers are willing to weaponize sea routes, and countries like Indonesia are becoming more assertive about claiming their fair share of global economic leverage. Analysts warn that what seems unthinkable today should not be taken as an immutable given. The norms that protect free passage through critical waterways have held for decades, but they are not guaranteed forever. Singapore's message was clear: as long as it has a say, the Strait of Malacca will remain open for everyone. But the fact that this message needed to be said at all tells you something important about the world we are now living in. The Strait of Malacca has been a highway of human civilization for centuries. Traders, explorers, empires, they all passed through here. And today, it remains just as vital, just as strategic, and just as contested. What Singapore did in April 2026 was more than a diplomatic statement. It was a defense of the rules-based international order that underpins global trade. It was a reminder that some things, like the freedom of the seas, are too important to be bargained away, even when the temptation exists. Whether that stand holds in the years ahead depends on whether the great powers can manage their rivalry without dragging the world's most important waterways into the conflict. For the sake of the global economy and for the billions of people whose livelihoods depend on the goods that flow through this narrow strip of water, let's hope they can. That's all for today. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe. And if you want to understand more about global trade, geopolitics, and the forces shaping our world, stay tuned. There's a lot more to come.